Okay, folks, we're going to get started. I'm Dan Rundy. I hold the Schreier Chair here at CSIS, and we're hosting Lars H. Thunell, who's the CEO of the International Finance Corporation. This is his exit interview. I want to send a special word of greeting to my former colleagues and friends at IFC who may be watching this online live streamed or who will be watching this later when it's recorded. We're really fortunate to have Lars Thunell with us today. And for those of you that don't know what IFC is, and I'll do this very briefly, and then we'll have a conversation with Lars Thunell. And there's a biography of Mr. Thunell that was outside, so I won't go into too much detail. But what you need to know about him and what you need to know about IFC is that Lars had a distinguished career in finance in Sweden, was very involved in solving the banking crisis in Sweden in the early 90s, and I hope maybe perhaps one of the things we might talk about briefly is what's going on in Europe and the financial crisis perhaps at the end of the conversation. And then joined IFC as its CEO in 2006, if I recall correctly, and has been CEO for 6.5 years, and his term ends on July 1 in about 5 weeks. So it's really a great pleasure and privilege to have him here with us. IFC, for those of you that don't know, is the International Finance Corporation. It's the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, and it's what's considered a development finance institution. Here at CSIS, we've done a lot of work looking at OPIC and other development finance institutions in the United States as well as internationally. So it's really great that we have the CEO of the largest development finance institution in the world, IFC, here with us. So, Lars, thanks again for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation.
So, Lars, my first question to you is, you've led IFC for the past 6.5 years. What are some of the biggest changes that you've seen in the development landscape since you started?
Well, I think first of all, we seen the tremendous emergence of the emerging markets as the driver of growth. Last year, I think 2/3 of the economic growth in the world was in the emerging markets, and in the World Bank we talk about the multipolar type of world we're in now, with a number of engines for growth. So I think that's one. The second one is the recognition of the private sector as the engine for growth and the focus on jobs, whether it's in the developing world or whether it's actually in the developed world. I think the focus now on growth, on jobs, has become very important. And you saw that, for example, in the OECD conference in Busan, Korea in December, where for the first time the private sector was actually acknowledged, and there was a declaration even that for the development and aid kind of architecture, the private sector and the IFIs relating to that was very important. I think those are the two very important thing. And the third one perhaps is the more and more focus on environmental and social standards, good governance, the anti-corruption, all of those things, good behavior, and what type of private sector do we want. I think has become and public sector has become the very important part. If you look at some sectors, I think the real growth, obviously the focus on infrastructure has been very important. And with the job focus, I think the whole question of SMEs, we can probably come back to that. And most lately, and as illustrated in the G8 meeting over the weekend, or actually the announcements by the US right before that, the agricultural and food supply, food security issue has become extremely important.
It's interesting because there's been a ongoing, maybe struggles the word for it, in the development community to make the case for private sector-led development. I think historically there was sort of the if you will, sort of the three bears story of development. If I think about the World Bank, I think of IBRD as the Papa Bear, and IDA as the Mama Bear, and IFC as the Baby Bear. But in some ways, the Baby Bear has all grown up in the sense that people have woken up and said the Baby Bear is now driving a car and has a sovereign wealth, is catalyzing sovereign wealth fund investments and is doing all sorts of things that think we should have realized all along that it was a central and important part of development, but oftentimes there were a lot more attention was given to other parts of development work. We were talking earlier about the size of IFC's investments in IDA countries. IDA countries are the poorest countries. IDA countries are the poorest countries that the World Bank Group works in. And you were saying to me that there was just tell me a little bit about what that's looking at.
Well, I think if you look at the total, given that the focus on private sector and the need for capital for that, IFC has grown quite dramatically. If you go back to 2006, we did about 6 billion for our own account and 7 billion total. We mobilized about 1 billion, basically through bank syndications. Last year, in total, we made $19 billion. And of that, about 12 was for our own account and 7 was mobilization. And as you said, the mobilization is no longer only the bank syndications, it's also through our asset management company. We are mobilizing funds from sovereign wealth funds and pension funds around the world on the equity side. And you also see some securitization. So that has been a kind of a dramatic, and that's our role, is to crowd in. If you then look at the focus on the poor countries, in 2006 we did about 25% of the volume and number of projects in IDA countries. Now, last year it was close to 50% of the number of projects, a little bit less on the volumes because the projects tend to be smaller in IDA countries. So there's been a kind of a dramatic shift. If you look at last year, we did about $5 billion in IDA countries, which can compare to IDA itself, which is about 15. If you then add that IDA, the pure IDA funds are basically unleveraged versus if we put things into the private sector, it normally leverages at least 3 times. So the whole question or the whole architecture is kind of changing. Another way of looking at this is of course also that we are much more focused now on the post-conflict and fragile states, where when I came we did very little there, but now we do quite a lot.
Yeah, I want to come back to you about that. Well, I'm curious about the fact that given that there's been this enormous growth in IFC, how that's changed your relationship within the World Bank Group. I think certainly you have some shared units. You do some work around investment climate with the World Bank Group. You have some dual-hatted folks. How's that relationship changed? We've written here at CSIS about the fact that we do not support, this is my personal view, we do not support, we'd like to have IFC, there's a specific monetary relationship currently with the World Bank around where IFC sends a $500 million a year of its profits to support general World Bank work of IDA and IBRD, and perhaps that's not something that we're going to be able to unwind given the fact that you have a variety of shareholders. You have a mix of sort of institutional linkages, you have some financial linkages, and I'm curious about sort of either the evolution of the relationship, both in terms of how you guys engage with each other, both at the main bank and other parts of the bank, but also how you think about that relationship going forward. What could it look like?
Well, first of all, I think the relationship between the World Bank and IFC has been an ongoing saga for the last 30 years or so, and it's always a question of what should that relationship look like. I think over the last couple of years under Bob Zelik's leadership, he has clearly recognized the role of the private sector and pushed very much for IFC involvement. I think the Busan conference, as I mentioned, was a step forward. I think we had at the spring meeting, the development committee was focused on the private sector. So there is a kind of a will now. I think the problem we're having is that you got basically economists who are focusing on the macro level, and you got IFC more focused on the micro level, and to get those to kind of connect.
To talk to each other and connect.
And strategically. I think personally there is a great opportunity there. I think if you can get the macroeconomists to really not act as central planners, but allow a little chaos with the private sector, and really try to move that agenda forward. I think there's great opportunities, and you're starting to see it at the country level. But I think there is more to be done at kind of this, whether it's country strategy levels or it is at the regional level. I think one area which has been particularly emphasis on has been infrastructure and PPPs.
Yep.
And there, I think, everybody loves the idea and that we should do more PPPs, whether you're a government official or whether you're private sector. The problem is that very few people, and they really understand what it is and the technicalities of it. So I think one of the things that's necessary at the country level is to build up the capacity, and which is what we, together with the World Bank, is doing it within a number of finance ministries. We're now establishing units for PPPs. So I think you need to get down to the kind of that very concrete level to really increase the I don't think you solve it by having one more department jointly managed. It kind of dilutes the accountability. I think it's really working together on a strategic level with very programmatic efforts. And we have some great successes. And this becomes more important when you deal with, like we've done, one of the successes is the Pacific Islands. Because it's small, it's far away, you really need to work together. Post-conflict countries is another area where I think there is great opportunities. I had a chance to visit South Sudan and Burundi just 10 days ago, and I think there the relationships is excellent and absolutely necessary because there is very limited capacity at the government level.
Let's talk about crowding in zones of conflict in particular. When here at CSIS, we've done a number of things to support the World Bank Group. I spoke before the U.S. Congress in support of what's called the general capital increase for the World Bank Group. And one of the reasons is that here, as a U.S. citizen, from a U.S. standpoint, there's a lot of interest both among Republicans and Democrats to support private sector-led growth and to support the work of the World Bank Group more generally in zones of conflict, as well as supporting anti-corruption, which is something I want to get to, as well as issues around governance, which I also want to touch on as well. But let's talk first about this issue of conflict. You were just in South Sudan, you've been to Burundi, you've also set up, using profits of IFC, a number of specialty funds in about 7 or 8 countries. I think it's called IFC Ventures, if I recall correctly. So just talk a little bit about, I think when you started in 2006, this was a very nascent part of the conversation. We're in a very different place as in a variety of conflict zones. Some of the Haiti, Burundi, South Sudan. You have country programs in Liberia and Sierra Leone. Talk a little bit about that and the instruments.
I think the starting point was that on my first trip actually for IFC, I went to DRC, and that was before the election of Kabila, and all the aid agencies, whether it was the UN, the USAID, or whether it was EU or World Bank, everybody was talking about the election and how they then going to reduce their funding and the support of DRC. And I was saying, but who is going to what's going to happen afterwards, and how are we going to build up the country? And that was the starting point for IFC's efforts in a systematic way to work in post-conflict and fragile states. And since then we have geared that up, especially using but not only finance, but also our advisory services, which are in those countries very, very important. Going in and helping to establish the investment climate, for example, the rules. Like in South Sudan, we have helped write the first 19 rules or laws relating to the private sector. The corporate law, the bankruptcy law, all of that stuff. IFC has helped with, and our staff was actually living in tents to start with a few years ago, doing that. So it's kind of amazing. And I think there is so you need to build that capacity, and then of course infrastructure is something that they just desperately need. If you look at South Sudan again, there is no real utility. 1% of the population has electricity, but it's basically from privately owned small generators. It's not anything where you have. So you need to get these things in. So in Liberia, we help, for example, with in Monrovia to build a power station. And I think these are the type of things we should be doing and are now doing. And there we can also work very closely with the bank and other aid agencies, because again, you need to coordinate it, because it's the government doesn't have the capacity to really deal with too many aid agencies. So that is something that we've done a lot of now.
Just want to, just as a plug, if people have questions, I'll be taking questions online, and you can send me an email at drunde@csis.org. It's DRUNDE @csis.org, and if you can, we'll collect them over the next 20 minutes or so, and then I'll scan through them. But again, drunde@csis.org. Okay, Lars, on this conflict area, because I think this is going to be an important part of the development future, is how we support private sector development in tough, what I call here at CSIS, tough, dumpy places. That's not a categorization you use at the bank, but I think that it seems to get the message across. General Petraeus, one of America's finest heroes, talked about the need for increasing and in supporting a set of instruments in places like Afghanistan to have what are called enterprise funds, which is in the American context, were essence equity funds that you all have done things like this. Talk a little bit about the sorts of instruments and approaches, and also I want to touch on the issue of the World Bank Group and IFC. And this is not a negative generalization, but I think was designed 50 or 60 years ago to work in oftentimes relatively more benign contexts, or less, and have been asked by its shareholders, the United States and others, to go to some really complicated places with a much harder set of context. You don't even have bankruptcy laws in place in a place like South Sudan. So the sorts of asks that you're making of folks in terms of both human resources and in terms of the sorts of processes and instruments, how have you dealt with that issue? Because I think that in particular is particularly tricky. Comparing a Brazil to a Burundi are very different contexts, both in terms of people and instruments.
I think as I said, we work a lot with our advisory services on establishing the laws, the regulations, building the capacity. You have the whole for the small, medium-sized enterprises. We also work a lot on the infrastructure side, as I mentioned, and more the food security. But what we're trying to do is move people from the informal sector. First of all, we try to support the informal sector through the microfinance, for example.
You all are the largest investors in
Yeah.
microfinance in the world,
Yeah.
which I think people don't realize.
We finance the microfinance institutions, and we train them. That's what we do.
Yes.
And last year, I think we did 8 million loans or so.
Yeah, I can't go to Lars Thunell and ask for a microfinance loan directly, but you are the backstop for hundreds and hundreds of
Yeah.
microfinance institutions.
So that is one thing that is very, very important. But we also then try to move some of these companies into the formal sector. We know that if a company moves, whether it's in a post-conflict country or in a regular country, if you move from the informal sector to the formal sector, you start to grow about 8 times as fast.
Really?
And you start to hire more people. You start to pay taxes. You can import and export. So that whole move is very important. That's why we focus so much, especially these days when jobs are necessary, whether it's in the developed world or in the developing world, where half of the population very often is younger than 25 years. That's where we
Move them into formality
so they can start growing. Let's remember that all the big companies we have here in the U.S., they were smaller once upon a time. So how do you nurture them to really start to grow is the big question, and create that local companies. And today, for IFC, about 70% of our clients are local. When IFC started 50 years ago, it was basically project finance, where we supported a big company from the West going into Africa or something like that. Today, most of what we do is local business or South-South business. We still do some of the big companies and work with them, and U.S. firms and so on, but the main emphasis now is building up that local capacity, whether it's on the private side.
What percentage of your business now is South-South business of any kind?
Well, you more and more see, it depends on how you define it, but we do a number of billions in cross-border and taking, first of all, establishing regional champions. If you look at Africa, for example, Many of the countries are really too small to be their own market, so you need to have kind of regional integration. So we spend a lot of time trying to develop what we call regional champions. And so they get bigger in East Africa, for example. And that also has the benefit of helping with kind of the infrastructure. We just, for example, did the Kenya Airways, supporting their expansion. They're doubling their fleet from 32 planes to 64. And that will have the benefit, of course, for the whole of Africa, because most of those planes will be used for communication between the cities in Africa. Before, you almost had to go back to Paris or London to go from one African country to the next one. But then we also see a lot of investments from, say, India into Africa, or we just did one in Egypt, from India into Egypt, pulp and paper company. And there you see that some of these companies, especially from middle-income countries, have developed kind of a business model and a technology that is very useful for other emerging markets.
Countries in the same context.
In the same context versus sometimes the more sophisticated US or European companies who have to adapt, and more are trying to do that, adapt their business models for the emerging markets.
Let's talk about food security, and in this conversation I want to also raise the issue of palm oil, which I know is something that you all had to... What I understand is that historically agriculture itself, lending directly to smallholder farmers, is a very tricky business, but there are a series of other aspects along the way of the value chain that are less so. And talk a little bit about how IFC participates in food security.
Well, we try to focus from everything from what we call the farm to fork, and hold that whole supply chain, which is very, very important. And we should remember that's important because if you look at Africa, for example, 40% of the food that is produced perish on its way to the marketplace. So, and especially now with the food prices as they are, and the commodity prices, soft commodity prices as they are, this is a big business opportunity. What business can you afford to have 40% of what you produce just perish? No, not many. So that has been, so, the whole infrastructure around the food supply chain, whether it's cold warehouses, the cold chains of trucks, that whole area, all the way out to the retailers, who very often are the ones standardizing the products and the supply chain. And then, of course, food processing, taking tomatoes and make them into ketchup. Take one very simple example. Obviously allows you to keep much more and also creates jobs and value added for the people. And then you got the whole question of farming, which is recently has become, we can say, political or needs to be. There has been no rules. If you look at mining, I think today we have pretty clear rules with the extractive industry transparency initiative and environmental and social standards. In agriculture, we're still trying to figure out what should the rules be, and you got the issue of, on the one hand, you need, especially in certain commodities, you need industrial farms to really get the productivity right. On the other hand, then you got issues of the smallholders. Smallholder farmers can be very, very productive if in certain commodities, which are kind of labor intensive.
And for example, cocoa, right?
Cocoa, exactly. But in here you got a whole issues then of environmental and social standards, of child labor, palm oil, and the whole question of forestry and rainforests needs to be addressed. And people are still trying to figure out what are the right, where are the right standards, and what is the right balance between providing development and on the one hand, but on the other hand, protecting the environment. Well, and just to answer your question on palm oil, that was one of the areas where we saw, as we were getting more and more involved in that there was no clear rules. So what, that normally the IFC environmental and social standards are very important guidelines for companies.
Yeah, I want to come back to that on equator principles.
And the equator principles that are used by all the world's banks for project finance, for example. But when it came to palm oil, there was no clear rules and a lot of controversy. And so we decided to basically stop doing that for a while and do a lot of consulting. It took us about 18 months. But we came up with I think reasonable rules and regulations for how this should be done that has been accepted by most people now, I think, and means that we can have gone back into that. But with following these rules and also making sure that we do consultations with local communities, if you got indigenous people, that they're treated the right way, that you protect the forests and don't create incentives to kind of destroy rainforests, for example. So I think we come to a better balance now, and that's why that's our role. That's IFC's role, is to actually do these type of things.
No, I mean, my view has always been, part of it has been to have a demonstration effect as part of your role. Part of your role has been to crowd in investment, share risk, but then also the standard setting function. One of the most significant things that IFC does was change the world in terms of environmental standards around the Equator Principles that your predecessor, Peter Voike, helped convene that and shape that around project finance. You just came out with an article last week in the Huffington Post. Tell us a little bit about what you said in that article.
Well, I think we had one of our big events during the year is a big private equity conference here in Washington for the emerging markets, and it's grown. And this year, I think we had over 800 people who came to that. But in connection with that, I thought that the private equity industry needs to think about, as it moves now into the developing countries, we see that as a clear trend. They need to think about their environmental and social standards. We know that for a number of reasons in various countries, private equity has become is politically a little bit sensitive. I mean, you have the debate here around jobs. You have it in Europe in some places where private equity has been involved in the elderly care. But you also have the environmental and social issues in the emerging markets, and I thought it was important that that's why I challenged the industry a little bit for them to think about what should their rules, as they now expand and move more and more into emerging markets, how are they going to do that? So that was what the op-ed was all about, and I think it was positively, I think, received. I know that a number of the big U.S. private equity firms have already hired their sustainability officers, for example. So it is happening. It's just it needs a little extra push.
Okay, let's talk about the financial crisis. But maybe perhaps before we get to that, maybe just spend a minute on your past life. You had another life at another time in Sweden, having to clean up a financial mess 20 years ago. So when you think about what you've seen over the last 3, 4, or 5 years here in the States and in Europe, maybe you could just spend a minute just talking about what when you look at it, what do you see and what needs to be done? And just start with that, and then if you could talk a little bit about what's IFC's role been in the crisis. Those two questions.
Sure. No, I think in Sweden in the early 90s there had been a property speculation and
this sounds familiar.
Boom, and it was like you have had now in many other countries, and basically some of the banks were nationalized, and I helped create the bad bank, and we have actually put people in, separated out, put people in who actually knew real estate and knew industrial operations, and took the ownership role, and were able to much quicker than the government had expected to kind of resolve all the issues and get the money back for the taxpayers. And actually today, Sweden's largest listed real estate company is actually something that we established, which shows that you can have bad financial constructions but good properties or real estate. So if you look at what's happening now, obviously there's been discussions, could this model be used? And it's being used in different countries, and I think it's a good model. Obviously Sweden was in a more positive situation because it was one of the few countries that was kind of doing not too good at that point in time, which meant that with the devaluation and other things could get the economy going again. It's much harder now when everybody is having problems and there's total lack. The other thing, if you look at the U.S. experience, of course, with the securitization, it was very hard to get your hands on the actual real underlying asset, which we could do. So then, of course, the U.S. Has a total different magnitude. But if you look at what's happening now, you see these discussions about bad banks in Spain, you see them in Ireland, you see them. And I think there are some experiences, and we have tried to share those. When it comes to the financial crisis and IC, what we saw was that was an opportunity for us to participate in a number of things in our crisis response. The first one was liquidity, because the liquidity was drying up after the Lehman crash, and especially in relationship to trade finance, because letters of credit and trade is very important, especially for the poorest countries, and they are the ones using letters of credits. So we, in response to the G20 London meeting, where there was talks about 200 billion worth of trade finance over 3 years, IFC actually, I think we did about 50 of those. The second thing we did was to say, okay, in Europe and in the US, the government has had, at least at that point in time, enough money to support the banking systems. But how about the systemically important banks in poor countries? There was really no money. So we set up a special fund together with the Japanese government for $3 billion, and actually to go in and support and take equity positions, putting capital into some of these banks. And that was, I think, worked out very well.
Have any of those turned out to be financially, in addition to doing the right thing, have they been financially had a good outcome?
Yes, that's one of the benefits of IC. You can come back.
Doing good and doing well.
Exactly. The third thing we did was support the microfinance.
Yeah.
Because they were very much affected by the crisis, and banks were pulling back their credit facilities for microfinance institutions. So we set up a special program there together with KfW in Germany and others. The third thing we did was to work on distressed assets, trying to figure out ways to get the bad assets off the balance sheet of the banks. And we established a number of platforms. And then perhaps one joint thing we did with EBRD, World Bank, IMF, was our crisis response for Eastern Europe and the banking system. Because what we saw was that all the banks, the European banks, were pulling back money from Eastern Europe. So jointly we came out with, I think it was about 25 billion euros, $30 million, or $30 billion. That was provided to support and add liquidity. And that was, I think, very successful and very well received. So these were a couple of things that we done. These are the type of things we're continuing to do, whether it's investing in banks in Africa. So continue. We have now revived with the latest go-around the trade finance programs again. We're putting in some additional things for the agriculture industry, commodity financing. We're gearing that up a lot now with warehouse receipts and other things. So this is work that we are continuing and have to, given where we are right now in the crisis.
Let me just touch on two other sectors that you all have done, that you've done a lot of work on. One is on health and education. You came out with a report. With the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation 5 years ago that talked about the enormous role and size and scope of the for-profit private sector in healthcare delivery in Africa. And that, in essence, it was basically saying that if you want to meet all of the objectives in terms of covering people in terms of healthcare, that we're going to have to use a different set of instruments and approaches than just funding public sector-driven healthcare solutions. That's not a political statement. It's just that there's a spectrum of interventions all over the world, whether it's the U.S. or otherwise, that's both public and private sectors, and it's a mix. And it's no different in some ways, in sometimes even more private sector driven in developing countries. But that's not in the mental maps of development people or oftentimes public health professionals. How was that report? You certainly came out with a report and had a big reception 5 years ago. You set up some funds and some ways to sort of take advantage of sort of this trend that you saw. What's happened with that, and how do you see other donors when they think about healthcare, that's one. And then on education, you've also taken some pretty risky positions in terms of going against orthodoxy. The development community has a series of orthodoxies around publicly funded basic education, and what you've said is, or IFC has said is, there's actually a lot of basic education is done through for-profit slum schools, for lack of a better term, whether it's in Africa or in India, and those are actually businesses, and that we ought to actually do two things. We ought to help them run their businesses better through technical assistance and what IFC calls advisory services, but you've also said we also ought to be helping banks take advantage of them and provide them with lines of credit so that they can build roofs over their heads or borrow money to pay for computers. So talk a little bit about the interventions in health and education, which are a little bit outside of orthodoxy. And second, what I'd be curious about is how other donors or DFIs have either followed suit or sort of resisted what you've done.
No, as you said, we looked at healthcare in Africa and said, how should we support that in a more programmatic? Because one of the things we've tried to do over the last 5 years in IFC is to work more programmatically and not only from transaction to transaction. And so we said, what should our role be in health in Africa? And we did this study which showed that actually the poorer the country, the more private the healthcare actually is, but it's extremely fragmented without any control whatsoever. So without taking really position of whether healthcare should be public or private, you know, I come from Sweden and we have a kind of a good healthcare system, but here it was very clear. And it was also clear that if you asked a mother, poor mother, where would she take her child if it was really sick? They said a private clinic. So we said, what can we do to help that? And here was one area where we worked together with the bank, because we said, first of all, it's the question of the investment climate and the quality control. Because there was
so the regulatory oversight.
The regulatory aspects. So together with the bank, we worked in a number of countries now in Africa in trying to get the regulatory framework in place. Second thing was, how do we get this fragmented kind of industry to be more professional, to gain scale and really increase? So as you said, we try to work with the banks. We do a lot of work with banks, which is our way of wholesaling down to the small, medium-sized enterprises, trying to get them to lend more to, which is hard because many clinics don't have, you know, buildings that they can put up as collateral and mortgage and so on. So it's more cash flow lending. We also put up a special fund for equity investments into these, which has been set up. So we did a number of things like that. It's been, let me be clear that it's been not easy. It is very fragmented to find that professional kind of platforms, but we've done some very interesting investments, and I think now we're taking another view. The reaction, I think, has been was very positive in some of the funds, some of the other in the fund that we established. Some of the other private sector focused IFIs came in. I think the banks have been very kind of positive in trying,
sure.
but to work on it. But it's been, as I said, hard, even though we share some of the risks with them. But it's something that I think gradually over time is happening. Has been the regulatory aspect in some of these countries has been very positive. When it comes to the question of education. It really goes back to the question of how do you find jobs for people, and that's where I think it's the key is, and there we have worked, as I mentioned before, a lot on the SME side, because it's small and medium-sized enterprises that really create jobs. So educating people there is important. We run what we call or some programs for entrepreneurs. So if you look at our total SME program, you've got, first of all, the investment climate. Secondly, working with banks to finance these small, medium-sized enterprises. Thirdly, risk capital, in other words, helping to establish, you can call it venture capital funds or growth funds, which are more and more happening now locally and not from New York or London or wherever. And then the training. And even as I mentioned, I was in Burundi, and there we actually run training of entrepreneurs. I met some fantastic young women.
Is this Business Edge or the SME Toolkit?
Business Edge.
Okay. So
And-
so for the lay people, what is Business Edge? This is the Encyclopedia Britannica. This is the poor person's MBA program, right? This is a book and classroom-led training program that IFC set up.
Yeah, we train the trainers basically, and then have some material. And it's now been translated, I think, into
15 different languages.
So it is something that is really there. So you have this whole package for the moving the SME forward. But what we also saw was that still, even if people are educated, I actually had before the Arab Spring, I had the Tunisian Prime Minister came here to Washington.
This is the pre-Arab Spring Tunisian
Exactly,
Prime Minister.
yeah. Came to Washington and said, hey, I need your help. I have 25% of my university graduates can't find jobs. There's something wrong here. So we start to talk about what could be done, and this is then some thoughts that so we went out together with the Islamic Development Bank and actually did a study which we
Yep.
called Education for Employment, E4E. And if you look at the conclusions, they are not kind of revolutionary, but it was very good to get them on and the whole issue was that you got students coming out. If you ask them themselves, they didn't think they had the right skills and the right knowledge. And if you ask employees, they said, we got jobs where you can't find the right people with the right skills. So the whole E4E project that we're now trying to roll out in the MENA region is really a question of how do we make these come together. So how do we help the universities to be listen more to the private sector on what is actually necessary? How do we get the students to select things that are actually useful in applying for a job? How do we maybe not always have to have the most sophisticated and the highest education, maybe more vocational training? So we're looking now at bringing some of especially the Germans are very good at vocational training, taking some of their best practices and trying to move those into the Middle East. So I think these are the things. And the more you talk about this with other people, you see that this is kind of a worldwide problem, is that we educate our young people not for jobs, but for something else, and we need to do that. And so the combination of having the SMEs with the supply chain also, you should remember that very often the SME sells to other bigger corporations. You have to work through the whole supply chain on the one hand, and on the other hand, working on making the education more relevant for actually getting jobs. That's where I think you have. Just one final comment when it comes both to education and health. I think it's important there to remember that when we talk about for profit, it doesn't always have to be for profit in the sense that they become listed companies and so on. It's more the business model of being able to be sustainable. Very often when we do these things, we actually work with schools or clinics that are owned by a trust. So the money is kind of recycled the same way.
It's a social enterprise.
Exactly.
We have to think about, there's a blend of models, and we talk a lot about scale and sustainability in the development business.
It's
and
the same.
It's a different approach to the same
It's the
issue.
same. It's the same thing with IFC actually. You know, we make money. We made $2 billion last year, but the money is used to expand the operations, and used also for some of our advisory services and so on. I think that's very important. And what's interesting here is that when all the research shows that there's a very positive correlation between financial success and development impact. So it's not a conflict, very obvious, but how do you select whether you're going to have a development impact or how you're going to be financially? They actually are very, very positively correlated. So that's why we focus on that. And the benefit of that is that we also are self-sustainable, and the shareholders don't have to put in more money. And as Tim Geithner said in one of these congressional hearings, that IFC is probably the place where the taxpayers get the biggest bang for their development back.
It's absolutely the case, but let me get to this issue that I think is one of the elephants in the room, is CDC, not the Centers for Disease Control here in the American context, but CDC is the OPIC or the IFC of the UK system. It's the Development Finance Institution of the United Kingdom. Just recently went through a major rethink or reorganization under the Cameron government to look at how do we balance this issue of development outcomes and profits. And there was some political decision or some sort of a decision. How do you balance this issue of financial returns and development returns? Certainly, in my mind, I can see, in my view, and certainly for many shareholders, they would prefer not having IFC come every year and ask for replenishments as we do with the IDA replenishment every 3 years. You don't have that in the case of IFC. You haven't had to go get a capital. You haven't necessarily needed a capital increase since the 80s. But if you could talk a little bit about how you balance that, because it seems to me that, and then just one point on that is, oftentimes you're making a significant profit, but at the same time there's some cognitive dissonance in that you spend, I guess, about $1 billion a year in technical assistance, which IFC calls advisory services. I don't think I ever used the word technical assistance while I was an IFC employee, because it wasn't really sort of the term that was the term of art in the building. But in essence, you often fundraise against that with bilateral donors. How do you manage this issue of, if you're making these profits, what is there is a rationale for it, but I'd be curious what the rationale is on how you balance the returns, but also how you finance the technical assistance or advisory services side.
First of all, as I said, there is a very positive correlation between development impact and financial sustainability. So it more becomes a question of where do you direct your business, and we are a development institution, so that's why we have moved so much more towards the frontier, towards the IDA countries. But we should also remember that's our unique capability. It's not only where we have the biggest additionality and the biggest development impact, but it's also our competitive advantage. The fact that we have decentralized and have now 100 offices and 60% of our staff, close to 60%, in the field.
And what was it when you started in 2006?
It was probably about 45% or
yeah.
so.
Okay.
So we have now a unique capability with our 100 offices in all these countries. And we actually see that our profitability is higher in Africa than in, say, Brazil and Mumbai, because we have very little additionality and very little competitive advantage in those,
in these bigger
where everybody else is. So that's why we're moving away from, in China, we're trying to be more niche. We're moving west. In India, we set up special programs for the poorest states, where you have 70% of the poor. In Brazil, we're moving to the northeast and the Amazons. So that's how we're trying to deal with that issue. So it's less of a conflict than you think it is. And by moving there strategically, we actually are benefiting both our development impact, but also having better sustainability. Now, you're obviously not going to have great profits in post-conflict countries, but I would look at that as, first of all, as a development institution, we should do that.
Absolutely.
We should take high risk. But second, it's also from a pure business point of view, it's actually an investment in the future, because when the country starts to take off.
I'm thinking of Croatia.
We have been there, and we know it, and we built up the trust, and we're ready to go. And that's where we really make the biggest profits. So if you look at IFC today, we have about 18 billion in capital. We got the shareholders have put in about 2.5. The shareholders have decided that we should transfer about $2 billion over to IDA.
Now, let me just stop you right there and say we've written extensively here at CSIS saying that we don't think that's a good use of the money. We'd prefer that IFC either keep the money for further investments or use it in tough, dumpy places in zones of conflict, or fund offbeat new approaches to private sector development, as opposed to funding big IDA. But that's an editorial comment on my part.
But anyway, so basically you built up this $18 billion without any kind of contributions. And it's been money made, especially in the middle income countries. So that is a good basis, and that's how IFC can continue to expand. But we are now more and more, we start to use our capital more and more efficiently. So capital in a few years' time will be a constraint on future growth. So that's one. Asking your or trying to answer your question on technical assistance or advisory services, as we call it. We actually spend not $1 billion. We spend about $400 million a year, and of that, we finance some with ourselves, some from donors, a way of leveraging, but also making sure that we're coordinating with others. I think that's very beneficial. And we're one of the few development institutions who also charge our clients for some of the work, especially when it's directly related to private sector, and so we don't compete with the normal consultant fees. It's very interesting also to note there that when we ask our clients, they're actually more satisfied when we charge them a little bit than when we don't charge them, because they're more engaged. They get closer into the transactions.
Well, Lars, this has been great. I want to see if folks here in the audience have been very patient, have some questions, and then I'm also going to ask Nikki to give me my BlackBerry to collect questions from the virtual audience. But let me first call on my friend and colleague Thelma Askey, who used to be the head of USTDA and also had a senior role at the OECD. Thelma?
Thank you. There's so many questions. It's an excellent presentation, but I just have two focuses that I'd like for you to clarify a bit. One is the role of the G20. You talked about the emerging markets emerging, and of course at the OECD they did reach out to these key countries as well. But those countries were busy in the G20. Could you reflect a little bit on how effective they've been, particularly on the development side, in, establishing guidelines and goals and objectives, and do the countries actually meet those? If you look at their communiques from 5 years ago compared to now, you can see how much they've dug into looking at directing themselves and having an effect. And then I also have a question about SMEs, because SMEs create a lot of jobs, but they also have a high failure rate. And you also talk about the fact that when they move from the informal to the formal sector, they grow, by 8 times and create even more jobs. So could you kind of connect the dots a little bit on how effective development is in promoting SMEs, preventing those failures or mitigating those failures, and then moving them into an area where they can create even more jobs?
Why don't I group a couple more questions? I got 2 questions from IFC colleagues who will go unnamed. One asking, what do you know about your successor? If you can talk a little bit about that. And then and the other question I got from somebody was, what will you be doing next? So if you can talk about those 2 as well, in addition to Thelma's more policy-related questions. Thank you.
Let me start with the SME question. First of all, I think one has to remember that is part of the whole kind of private sector capitalistic system that some companies succeed and some don't. If you look at, even in the US, if you look at a typical venture capital fund, I think what the arguments goes that most of the firms actually change their business model 2 or 3 times before they succeed. About half of them, or 4 of them, 4 out of 10 go bankrupt. 3 or 4 does okay, and if you're lucky, you got one really successful company that really takes off. And I think that's one of the problems in if you look at our independent evaluations and so on, they normally look at everything has to succeed. But in private sector, actually, some shouldn't succeed. So I think one has to look at it instead of as a portfolio and saying how many of these actually are growing. And there are some other statistics that shows that companies, if they're good, they actually grow more the first 5 years than after. There is a number of statistics going different ways. But I think we have to accept and look at this as a kind of a portfolio and make sure that the overall effect is positive. I mean, it's the same thing as the debate you have around private equity in this country right now. Is it a job creator or a job destroyer? It's both.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. But in a very new kind of least developing country, you have individuals that are kind of sinking savings or getting a microloan to. You're not talking about private equity firms. So how do you mitigate some of those?
We're establishing, as Dan was saying, we have a kind of SME ventures, which is basically private equity in places like Liberia and because we're trying to get them started all over the place. But I think that is the fact that most of them actually develop and change their business model. That's part of the kind of.
Well, let me just, on this issue of SMEs, this SME Ventures, it's a combination of equity, lending, and technical assistance all in one package and housed in one place.
Trying
right?
to increase the success ratio, if you put it that way.
And in some very different, there are 8 countries, if I recall, and each were sort of, you in essence did a request for proposals from different fund managers to compete for each of the eight countries, and somebody said to me they couldn't believe that there would be an SME equity fund plus, if you will, for Nepal, and that people would bid on it, and there actually were folks that came out of the woodwork to actually bid on this, and so.
No, I think that's exactly what we're trying to increase this, as put in your terminology, increase the success ratio. And how do you do that? You do it by having banks who understand what they're lending. You do it by having training the entrepreneurs, helping them to write business plans and credit applications. I mean, it's not easy to write a credit application for a normal person in a post-conflict country. Let's face it. So that's. On the G20, I think, I mean, obviously, as I mentioned very in the very beginning, what we've seen here is the emergence of the emerging countries and the developed countries as part of the kind of global architecture, and I think it's therefore natural that they are part of the G20 and not only having the G8s, because they are very important parts of the whole community, and that's what you see also reflected in the World Bank and NIFC, where these countries have gotten more voting power, and there's a trend, and that has to shift, I think, even more over time. Obviously, the shareholders will have to decide on the pace of that one. So I think that is a natural thing. I think it was very, if I look at our experience has been, I think the messages coming out of the London meeting when there was a real crisis was simple to interpret, was easy to act on. After that, it's been kind of a little bit more diffuse, but there was some. Now it was the G8 is here, but I think the U.S. Had a good initiative now on the agriculture side on last week on the private sector. So there are things, whether they come out in the G8 or the G20. I think that's a reflection of the changing landscape in the world economy, with Asia especially and the BRIC countries stepping up, and that gets me to the question of my successor. I mean, obviously now we have had a big debate on who should lead the World Bank and who should lead the IMF, and I think we've come to some good conclusions, but obviously
There was an intense horse race at the IMF between a French person and a French person, right? So there was that was.
But you have that now sorted out, and now I think the question is, in the positions that are left, will there be candidates from the emerging markets? When I look at it from a very, and I always believe that it's up to the shareholders to make the decisions, and as a former outgoing CEO, you shouldn't have too much of opinions about this, and not try to mix into it. But I think what I've said is, I think it's very important to have somebody with a private sector kind of background who understands the private sector. And that is not only for IFC, I think it's actually also for the World Bank Group, to have somebody in that leadership group up there who understands the private sector, given what we talked about in this conversation, the importance of private sector in development going forward. So that's been the thing that I've allowed myself to have a very strong opinion. I think if you look at the selection process, if we end up with somebody from emerging market, again, I think that'd be very, very good for the organization in total, because I work very hard to have at IFC's leadership team to have good mix of both from a gender perspective, but even more important from a developing part one, part two perspective, and I've seen the benefit of that diversity in terms of understanding what goes on in our client countries and the places where we do business. I think that be fine, but obviously this is something that the shareholders will have to decide.
Well, you're leaving July 1. What's next for you, Lars?
Well, we'll see. I think I wait until July 1 to make up my mind. But I decided not to take on a full-time operating job. I decided to, at least for some time, stay in Washington and have a portfolio of things where I can be useful and have fun. That's my two things that I'm going to be focusing on as criteria.
Okay, other questions here. Sir?
Yes.
Just push the button, if you would. Push the silver button.
Silver button.
Okay. My name is Kunio Kikuchi, and thank you, Lars. I was in IFC until 2000 for 10 years, and before that, 20 years in the World Bank. One of the things that strike me about the change in, there are so many questions, but is the change in the environment in terms of information flow. Back in the 80s, I was working on huge projects in Thailand for land-based telephone projects. And then around the 90s, we started getting mobile telephones. And at that time, the World Bank said, well, this is a luxury item. We don't provide assistance to luxury. Today, nobody talks of cell phones, or now it's called smartphones, whatever, as luxury items. The poorest countries can afford them. Information is ubiquitous. In that environment, do you think IFC going forward will take advantage of this kind of availability of information to get the message to even the poorest countries on how to develop small industries or so forth and make themselves growing job creators?
Let me just see if I catch any other folks with questions here in the audience. Eleanor? World Bank style. Eleanor?
Well, congratulations on all the accomplishments IFC has achieved under your leadership. Do you feel something was neglected, or is there any one thing you would advise your successor to focus on going forward? Where do you see it going?
Thank you. I worked many years at the Inter-American Development Bank, Pietro Masci with George Mason, and recently I retired and went back to Europe. It struck me the fact that in many countries in Europe in which you have these very bad crises, in many respects they failed to undertake a series of reform of the government, of the private sector, regulation of the financial market. And with the development mind that comes from the Washington institution, the question that I would like to ask you is, would it make sense going forward that institutions like the IFC, the World Bank, would be also involved not only in lending, but also in technical assistance in these European countries?
Okay, so 3 different questions.
Okay. On the telecom, on the telecom side, IFC has been very much involved in establishing mobile phone systems in many countries. I think one of the last ones we were involved in was in Afghanistan.
Yeah, you were an early investor in one of the 2 cell phone companies in Afghanistan.
And that's very important, and we're now taking that to kind of a new level, trying to use the technology, as you said. The most spectacular one, I think, is actually in mobile banking. You have, what is it now, 5 billion people with telephones. You got 2 billion people or 2.5 billion with bank accounts in the world. Obviously, mobile banking is something that is moving very quickly now, and actually it's interesting there. The technology is moving faster in the developing world because they don't have access to the PCs which we use for internet banking in the US and Europe. So we see a number of countries where, especially in Kenya, for example, we have a great company that we're involved in called Fino in India that is also using biometric methods for ID and stuff like that. I personally was in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, opening a bank branch in a valley that had never seen a bank before. It was based on our work with Digital, establishing the mobile phones and then linking that to use for communications for banks. And I think more and more we're going to see also our SME toolkit and other web-based systems being used for that purpose. So I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things that I've been trying to push now is given that we have the more and more the telecom, we got the broadbands, is how do we establish IT service companies in the local markets. I think very often that could be done also together with e-government, which would have some benefits in terms of efficiency of governments and corruption issues and transparency. If you can get these things to work together, I think that's one of the things. Getting to the next thing, I think developing kind of modern technology in some of these countries is one thing. Otherwise, I think I've not talked so much about our own change process, but I think one of the things within IFC is that we have shifted from a project finance to more general corporate loans, and now more and more towards equity. Our equity portfolio has increased. It's now about $12 billion in market, if you mark to market. And the type of work that you need to do and the type of client relationship you need to have is different if you do project. In project finance, basically most of the work is done until you sign the deal. And if you got the right covenants, you just monitor what happens with the client afterwards. In equity, when you do an equity investment, the work really starts when you sign the deal, and you should work with the client trying to develop the client so it becomes successful, add value to their process. And that's a cultural shift. So we need to, I think, continue to focus on what we call portfolio management and make that a much kind of hotter internally type of thing to work on, and add more resources to that and change the culture more towards not only seeing the downside in the credit risk, but actually seeing the upside and the growth and of these companies. So I think that is very important. On the question of should we get involved in developed countries, actually there is one area where IFC went back in, and that was Korea in 1998, I think, where they had kind of graduated, but then with the crisis we went back in. I think it will be some time. There's so much work to be done still in the emerging markets, but over time I think it may be changing, but I think it's going to be maybe 10, 15, 20 years out. You know, as we focus these developments, to focus more and more on public goods, you know, climate change. Why should we only do climate change work in kind of China and work with energy efficiency there? Why not in some of the other countries? There are some advice, as you said, to crisis management, and we already do. We do some work, for example, on advisory services in places like Saudi Arabia, which is on the borderline, I guess, between part one and part two. where they pay for the services. And I think the bank is thinking similarly about some of their advisory services. So I think it's going to happen, but I think it's not going to happen in the short run. I think our most important role will continue to be in the poorest countries. So I think, just finishing up on the question, on your question again, I think moving even more towards, the poorest, because I think that is where we have the biggest development impact, which is our mission. But also, I think that's where we will have biggest competitive advantage.
Lars, this has been tremendous. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking
Enjoyed it.
Lars Thunell.
Thank you.